Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture on Trasna na Tíre. I'd like to especially welcome all those who might be new to the group and to those who follow the History Hub Ulster pages. Before we hand over to our guest lecturer tonight, can I just highlight next week's fascinating lecture, 10,000 Teeth Later, What Have I Learned, by Catherine Power, which will be hosted next Wednesday, the 16th at 8 p.m. and details can be found on the Trasna na Tíre Facebook page. Also, if anyone has any questions they would like to ask Nigel at the end of the lecture, please feel free to ask through the comments section and I will bring them to him at the end. So this brings us to tonight's lecturer, Nigel Henderson. This is Nigel's second lecture with us on Trasna na Tíre. He's first been ex-servicemen's cottages of Northern Ireland, which was presented in June and can be viewed on YouTube. Nigel is a history graduate of Queen's University in Belfast and a member of the History Hub Ulster. Nigel has been carrying out Great War research for more years than he cares to remember, and in addition to his core passion of researching Belfast Presbyterians who served in the Great War, he has provided research services to several local councils and district museums. Nigel has been documenting war-related graves and memorials in Ulster and has been researching the facilities to include family details that are not present on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. Nigel is in the process of documenting the cottages built in Northern Ireland for ex-servicemen and researching the original or early occupants of these cottages. Tonight's talk relates to the German air raids on Northern Ireland, with a particular emphasis on those buried in two Belfast cemeteries. As Nigel will shortly explain, his primary interest in this aspect of the Second World War focuses on identifying where the fatalities were buried and adding in information such as birth and marriage details that is not documented in the official records. So hand over to you, Nigel, and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you. Before I start tonight's talk, I'd like to draw people's attention to today being the 104th anniversary of the Battle of Gulemont, which is a phase of the Battles of the Somme 1916. The reason I'm doing this is because the 16th Irish Division played a key role in that battle and captured the town of Gulemont itself. It was a one-day battle and 513 men from the 16th Irish Division were killed on 9th September 1916. 420 of those fatalities, nearly 82% of them, have no known grave and are commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial in France. Giving a very rough breakdown by the provinces, 140 men were born in Leinster, 118 in Ulster, 82 in Munster and 30 in Connaught. 134 were born in Great Britain and or the Channel Islands, and 9 were born outside the British Isles, 5 in India, and 1 each in Japan, Argentina, and Canada. So you can see there's a wide scope of where these guys came from. The memorial cross that I'm just about to show you, this memorial cross, is from a 1922 newspaper. And this was the original memorial that was erected between the towns of Ginchy and Gulemont, where the 16th Irish Division had fought 2 battles in very close succession in September 1916. It's, as far as I'm aware, it is the earliest battlefield memorial that's dedicated to a specific division. And that was in place in October 1916. 10 years later, it was replaced by the memorial, which is currently at that site, which is a stone memorial, and the wooden cross was brought back to Dublin, and I believe it's in the National Museum, but somebody else could maybe correct me on that. So I just felt it was important today, as the 9th of September commemorates the Battle of the First World War, that we took the time to remember those men. So having done that, I'm now going to move on and do the main part of the talk. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, council areas across the United Kingdom were asked to draw up lists of civilian fatalities. The criteria stipulated that the deaths had to be due to enemy action. For example, death caused in air raids, death caused in naval bombardments, and so forth. The civilian war dead roll for Northern Ireland records the names and details of 881 people who died in the German air raid, civilians. In April and May 1941. It also includes the names of 30 people who died as a consequence of the Second World War, but not as a result of enemy action. The most common cause for these fatalities were handling of training ordnance or explosive devices. So because a lot of the training had been done in rural areas, mountainsides and so forth, there were bits and pieces of grenades and whatever else lying around, and people would be picking these up, and then suddenly they'd go off and, well, they would die. So technically they shouldn't be on the civilian war dead list, but they are. So I just wanted to mention them as an aside. The civilian war dead list, which was compiled in either the late 1940s, early 1950s, there are hard copies of it in various locations, but the details can also be accessed on the Commonwealth War Graves website, and you can select civilian war dead. I've identified a further 33 names from a variety of sources of people who died during or as a direct consequence of the air raids. These have come from a variety of sources, including the burial records for the reserve ground at Belfast City Cemetery, Civil Defence Authority casualty returns, and death notices. So that gives us a total of 914 civilian fatalities due to the air raids, and there were also a number of military fatalities, military locations, hospitals, etc., which were bombed. To date, I have identified the burial locations of 604 of the 914 civilian fatalities. And there are burials in each of the counties of Northern Ireland, and there are also burials in County Monaghan, 2 people, and 1 in County Laois. For a further 30 fatalities, burial locations have been identified for other members of the family who died in the German air raids. So it's probable that those members of the family who aren't buried in with their relatives are either in the reserve ground at Belfast City Cemetery or Milltown Cemetery, or there were no remains recovered to be buried. Of the fatalities, 508 that I've identified burial locations for, 508 are buried in graveyards in the Greater Belfast area, with 172 in Belfast City Cemetery and 41 in Milltown Roman Catholic Cemetery. And that's going to be the focus of tonight's talk. In the aftermath of the main air raids, in other words, 15th, 16th April, and then 5th, 6th, 7th of May, bodies were laid out in St. George's Market in Belfast for identification purposes, and basically people could turn up to see if they could identify the bodies of either relatives or neighbors or whatever. A pretty grisly situation, because for a lot of the remains, sometimes they could only be identified by the clothing that they were wearing or some other means of identification, because the bodies were so mangled. Any bodies or remains which were either not identified or were identified but not claimed for private burial were buried in the reserve grounds at either Belfast City Cemetery or Milltown Roman Catholic Cemetery. And obviously the ones that were buried in the Roman Catholic Cemetery, there would have to be something intrinsic about the body which indicated that the body was a Roman Catholic. I'm not sure the exact process of how that was achieved, but that must have been what happened. So why would there be people who could be identified and not claimed for burial? Well, for one thing, it could be a neighbor said, oh yes, that's Jimmy that lived across the street. Or it could be that a family member had identified somebody from their family, but they couldn't afford the cost of a burial. I'm aware of one situation where a 16-year-old girl, who was the only person left in her family, identified her brother in St. George's Market, but she couldn't afford to have his body removed from that temporary mortuary and given a private burial. However, any of the burials in Belfast City Cemetery, at any rate, for identified but unclaimed bodies, their coffins were marked with their name so that they would know, there would be a record of who they were. From the cemetery records, this is the reserve ground in Belfast City Cemetery and a memorial which was erected in latter years. I'm not quite sure how old it is, but it certainly doesn't date back to the immediate aftermath of the Blitz or the Second World War. From the cemetery ledgers, it is known that 209 people were buried in this plot of ground. 49 of the bodies had been identified and the coffins bore a name and an address. Sometimes the records would just record that it was a female child or an adult male, or sometimes it was just even adult, because the bodies were so mangled, it was not possible to determine whether it was a male or a female. And that's the tragedy of the whole Blitz scenario. We really do not know how many people died. We've got a figure of 914, but there will be other bodies, there will be other people who died, and because they maybe lived alone or they weren't part of a close-knit community, they've maybe slipped through and nobody said, oh, well, old Mrs. Smith that lived across the road, she hasn't been around, so she's probably a Blitz fatality. And we don't know how many people have slotted into that. There's also the situation that a lot of the remains, because they couldn't be identified, it's not possible to have names on a register without evidence. So for a lot of the unidentified, they're not recorded as a fatality because there's no name to go with the entry. So that's the reserve ground in Belfast City Cemetery. This is the reserve ground at Milltown Roman Catholic Cemetery. And I think most people here this evening will agree that the memorial that has been erected in this cemetery is far more pleasing. It's far more aesthetically pleasing on the eye than the one in Belfast City Cemetery. Again, I haven't had access to the records for the Roman Catholic Cemetery, so I don't know how many people were buried in this plot, or indeed whether any of the burials were identified. So I'm working a bit on the blind side with that. Just want to make a point about the death ages, and I've got a number of locations or sources displayed. The death age recorded on the civilian war dead list is often at variance with other main sources, either the civil death register or, for burials in city council cemeteries, the age that's recorded on those. So over here we've got for Georgina Brown, we've got Commonwealth War Graves says she was 48. The burial register in City Cemetery says she was 49. And the official civil death register has her age as 48. You could then have a fourth potential date of age at death, and that would be an age that's calculated from the person's actual date of birth. In a minute, I'm going to look at the Brown family in a greater detail, but you can just see that how confusing this can be, because if you're trying to track this person back to the census records or the date of birth, you could be looking in the wrong location depending on what source you're using. As far as possible, the death ages that I will be quoting in this talk are based on when the person died or when the person was born, and calculating forward from that. If there's still a discrepancy, or if I can't identify, I will then go with the civil register of deaths, which I think is going to be more accurate than the other two sources. So moving on to one of the first graves in Belfast City Cemetery, and this is the plot for the Brown family from Burke Street, which is in the New Lodge area. 4 members of this family died on the night of 15th, 16th April, and 3 were buried in this plot on the 22nd of April. The 4 members of the family cover 3 generations. Mary Jane McDowell married John Brown, who was a carter, on 1st May 1877 at Newington Presbyterian Church in Belfast. One of their children was Henry, and he was born on 7th May 1889 at Osborne Street in the Duncairn ward. He was an engine works labourer when he enlisted with the Royal Navy on the 1st of May 1907. He served as a stoker throughout the Great War, being demobilised on the 4th of June 1919. Georgina Briggs was born on 25th March 1881 at Ambrose Street in the Dock Ward to Joseph Briggs and Harriet Gray. Henry Brown was a carter when he married Georgina Briggs on the 13th of July 1920 at St Barnabas Church of Ireland on Duncairn Gardens. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Henry Brown returned to naval service on the 18th of October 1940, and he became a stoker first class on HMS Caroline, which, as many of you will know, is still moored in Belfast. Buried in this plot are Mary Jane Brown, who was 89 years old when she died, Henry Brown, who was 51, and Georgina Brown, who was 50. Now, if I just skip back to the previous slide. Oh no, now how am I going to get back? So if we go back here, we've got 48 recorded on Commonwealth War Graves, 48 recorded on the Civil Death Register, 49 recorded on the Burial Register, but when you go from her date of birth, her age was 50. The body of Georgina Brown, their 18-year-old daughter, was either not recovered or not identified. Her remains may be buried in the Blitz ground in an unmarked coffin, or she may just have not been, her body not been recovered. The recumbent plaque, the Commonwealth War Graves recumbent plaque, was only installed at this grave within the last 5 years or so. If you're wondering what a Commonwealth War Graves recumbent plaque is, it is this sort of thing here, which is square. It sits close to the ground and it's canted. They were designed for burials in earthquake zones like Gallipoli and Salonika, because when there was an earthquake, they wouldn't fall over, unlike the upright headstones. They're increasingly popular in Northern Ireland, particularly for Roman Catholic burials, because they're not as obvious and they're not as military. There's no military insignia on these recumbent plaques, although the person's rank and service number and regiment or service, etc., will be recorded, but they're just a wee bit different from the standard Commonwealth War Graves headstone. I could not find any memorial. You can see there's a cross that has fallen apart on the plot, but there's no names recorded on the plinth. So we just don't know the circumstances for that, but it's probably down to the fact that the family didn't have sufficient resources to be able to pay for the details to be engraved on a headstone. The second family is the Carter family from Dock Street. 7 members of this family were killed again on the night of 15th, 16th April 1941. 3 of the members were buried in this plot on the 20th of April. Joseph Carter was born on 11th June 1895 at Sheeptown near Newry to Arthur Carter, who is a stonecutter, and Francis McCulloch. In 1911, he was an apprentice mechanic, and he served in the Great War with the Army Ordnance Corps. He's commemorated on the memorial tablet in Downshire Road Presbyterian Church in Newry. Joseph, 45, Mary Ann, 37, and 5 of their children were killed. The children were Alice, who was 16 years old, Sarah, who was 14, Kathleen, who was 12, Mary, who was 9, and Joseph, who was 6. Alice, Kathleen, and Joseph are recorded as being buried in this plot, and it must be presumed that the bodies of the other members of the family were either not recorded or were not recovered. Another son, Andrew Carter, was in active service with the Royal Air Force at the time of the bombing. Daniel Gordon Fee was born on 3rd December 1915 at Collier Street in Duncairn Ward to William Fee and Mary Gordon. He married Minnie Fraser on the 28th of May 1938 at Crumlin Road Presbyterian Church, which was damaged during the Blitz, badly damaged and had to be rebuilt. Daniel and Minnie were living at Farringdon Gardens in the Ardoyne area, so not far from Crumlin Road Presbyterian Church. And Daniel was a fire watcher with the Belfast Harbour Commissioners. Fire watchers, as the name implies, were people who were employed to keep an eye out for fires developing and to then call the fire brigade so that they could be put out swiftly. He was killed at Pollock Basin during the first German air raid on 8th April 1941 at the age of 25. Eight members of the McGladery and Douglas families are commemorated on two adjacent plots, with 6 of the fatalities being buried on the 22nd of April. As you can see, one of the headstones is quite badly eroded, and for the other one, some of the lead lettering has either fallen off or been removed. So we'll start with the McGladery. Samuel McGladery was born around 1863 to Hugh McGladery and Mary McElrath. And Sarah Jane McLaughlin was born on 9th September 1876 at Malcolm Street in the Ormo Road to John McLaughlin and Rose Ann Mulholland. Samuel was a carter when he married Sarah Jane McLaughlin on 16th February 1908 at Trinity Church of Ireland in Belfast. Trinity Church of Ireland, the area where it was located, Unity Street, Trinity Street, was devastated during the Blitz, and Trinity Church of Ireland was destroyed as a building. They were living at 12 Kendall Street in the Old Park area in 1911. They were still living at the same address in 1939. Sarah Jane died at Kendall Street on the 16th of April at the age of 64. Her husband Samuel was injured at the family home and died later the same day at the Royal Victoria Hospital at the age of 72. Emily McGladery, one of their children, was born on 8th May 1911 at Kendall Street to Samuel and Sarah Jane. She married William Douglas on the 14th of January 1930 at the Belfast Registrar's Office. In 1939, they were living at Ballynuer Street, and William Douglas enlisted for war service with the Royal Artillery. Emily was 29 years old when she died, along with 5 of their children: Sammy, aged 9, William, aged 8, Jim, aged 7, Peggy, aged 5, and Sally, aged 1. Emily and 3 of her children are buried in this plot, but all 6 members of the family who died in the air raids are named on the headstone. They're commemorated on the headstone. So for those ones, I've included them in the figures of identifying where somebody is buried, because burial commemoration to me go hand in hand. Three members of the Macaulay family from Bromley Street in the Shankill area died, and 2 were buried in this plot on the 23rd of April 1941. George Macaulay was born on 1st December 1894 at Riga Street, and his parents were Robert Macaulay and Sarah Matthews. Margaret Neil Sangster was born on 20th January 1892 at Upper Meenan Street, also in the Shankill area, to Andrew Sangster and Mary Jane Douglas. Whether that Douglas family were connected to the other Douglas family that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, I don't know. But given the locality, the Old Park Road and the part of the Old Park Road where they lived in Kendall Street was not that far from the Shankill Road, so it's quite possible that there is another family connection there. George and Margaret married on 7th January 1917 at St. Anne's Parish Church in Belfast, now St. Anne's Cathedral. George was 46 and Margaret 49. Were buried in this plot on the 23rd of April 1941. Their son Walter, who was 14, also died in the Blitz, but his body was either not recovered or not identified. He's not buried in this plot, and he's not commemorated on the headstone. The headstone at this plot is quite obviously a modern headstone and was probably erected after the death of Emma Allen in July 2012. Whether it replaced a previous headstone, I don't know. Although I do know of one situation in Carnmoney where a modern headstone has replaced an earlier headstone which had a Blitz fatality commemorated on it, and the information was transferred across, and then just the additional death was added to it. So I would guess that there was no headstone in place here, because for a lot of the Blitz fatalities, there was no headstone because people just didn't have the money to pay for a headstone, if there was indeed anyone from the family left in a position to be able to do so. Moving on to the last case for Belfast City Cemetery. Not far away, you can see the Macaulay plot here, and we've got the Walker plot here. And this particular section Glenalina T1, outside of the reserved space, the reserve ground, there's more Blitz fatalities buried in this section than any other section in City Cemetery. Annie McCulloch was born on 23rd January 1868 at Brashane to William McCulloch and Anne Russell. She married Joseph Walker on 4th May 1893 at Trinity Church of Ireland in Belfast. Joseph Walker died of tuberculosis on the 19th of May 1905. One of their sons, William, served in the Great War with the Army Cyclist Corps and the Royal Irish Rifles, being awarded the military medal. He was demobilised in March 1919. Annie Walker died at the Belfast Union Infirmary on 21st April 1941 from injuries received during the night of 15th-16th April 1941. She was 73 years old, and she was buried in this plot on the 23rd of April 1941. Annie is not listed on the Commonwealth War Graves Civilian War Dead list, but a death notice placed in the Belfast Telegraph records that she died as a result of enemy action. Now, whether she would be entitled to be added on to any official records or not is not for me to decide. But as far as I'm concerned, the fact that she was listed as a death as a result of enemy action in a newspaper death notice, to me, that is sufficient evidence to warrant including her on my records. So I'm going to leave Belfast City Cemetery, walk a couple of hundred yards down the Falls Road, and go into Milltown Cemetery, the Roman Catholic cemetery in Belfast, or the major Roman Catholic cemetery in Belfast. I'm going to start off with one which caused me quite a bit of frustration, shall we say. The headstone, as it records it, says, McVeigh at the top, in memory of a loving father and grandfather, James, died 5th January 1957. Also his sons, Francis, Charles, his wife Elizabeth, and their little Dennis, killed in the Belfast Blitz, April 1941. Whenever I was looking at the official records, I found that there's no entry on either the civilian war dead list or in any of the Civil Defence Authority returns for a Charles McVeigh, an Elizabeth McVeigh, or a Dennis McVeigh. Initially, I thought, well, these are people that have just slipped through the gap and they haven't been added on for some reason. But it's only when I started doing the detailed research in terms of trying to find out birth registration details, marriage registration details, that the plot unraveled. The Charles and the Elizabeth and the Dennis that are mentioned on this memorial, their surname was not McVeigh, it was Fullerton. Charles Daniel Fullerton was born on the 11th of June 1908 at Saunders Street in Victoria Ward, to William Fullerton and Suzanne Rosewarne. The family was living at 55 Sussex Street when William died of tuberculosis on the 19th of August 1913. His widow Susan then married James McVeigh on 2nd August 1914 at St. Patrick's Church on Donegal Street. They had a son called Francis, who was 20 when he died in the air raid and was buried in this plot on the 19th of April. So the Francis here was a son of James McVeigh and his wife Susan. The Charles was the son of Susan and her former husband, her original husband. Elizabeth Toner was born on 2nd January 1910 in McDonald Street to James Toner and Bridget Lyons. Charles Daniel Fullerton married Elizabeth Toner on the 16th of January 1937, and they had one child, Dennis. Charles was 32 when he died, Elizabeth was 31 when she died, and their son Dennis was 3 years old. Dennis Fullerton is buried in a marked coffin in the reserve ground at Belfast City Cemetery, but the resting place of Charles and Elizabeth Fullerton have not yet been verified. Again, it's probable that there was nothing to bury or that their bodies were not recovered. Charles Fullerton and his stepbrother Francis McVeigh both died at Sussex Street, and both were ARP wardens at post 637, which was located on Great George's Street in the Dock Ward. So you can see that sometimes the information that's on a headstone, whilst it appears to be plain, can sometimes be a bit convoluted. This is probably one of my favorite Blitz-related graves in either cemetery. The memorial cross, the Celtic cross, is at the Flood plot, and it commemorates the death of Thomas Flood, who was 20, and he was from Pilot Street, and he died at the McKenna house in Beer Street along with Miss Frances McKenna, aged 18. Whilst there's no evidence, I think it's reasonable to conclude that they were involved in a relationship. Thomas and Frances were buried on the 18th of April 1941 in the Flood family plot, following a funeral mass at St. Joseph Church, the Roman Catholic Church in the Sailortown district of Belfast. Thomas was a son of Thomas Flood and Catherine Crean, and Frances was a daughter of Francis McKenna and Ellen Conlon. It's the only reason that I can think of as to why two people who were within 2 years age of each other, but were from different families being buried in the same plot, that they were maybe engaged or certainly going out together. And I think it's nice that their final resting place has been marked in that way. And there's nobody else, there's no other names on this memorial cross. The other members of the Flood family are not recorded on it. And I think, again, that's out of respect for the people that were killed during the German air raids. The McGladery family of Holmdene Gardens. 4 members of this family died in the Ardoyne area on the night of 15th, 16th April. William Henry McGladery was born in Glasgow on 9th December 1905 to William Henry McGladery and Isabella Lavery, and they later lived at Trafalgar Street in the Dock Ward of Belfast. Bridget Madden was born on 27th March 1914 at Gardiner Street in the Woodvale Ward to Thomas Madden and Margaret McCormick. William Henry McGladery Jr. and Bridget Madden married on 14th May 1933, and they had 3 children. William enlisted with the Royal Ulster Rifles, and he was serving with 2nd Battalion when he was wounded on the 1st of June 1940 during the Dunkirk evacuation. He came home to recuperate, and whilst he was recuperating or awaiting reposting, he was attached to the 70th Battalion of the Royal Ulster Rifles, and he was 35 years old when he died. Bridget was 27 years old. These photographs, incidentally, I nicked from an ancestry family tree. So if the the relatives are watching, my apologies. Margaret, known as Rita, was 3, and their son Robert was only 16 months old. Annie McGladery was the sole survivor from this family, and she was living with her paternal grandmother at Camlock in County Armagh in 1942. I know this because in 1942, there was an in memoriam notice placed in the Irish News that recorded the details of this family. A Commonwealth War Graves headstone was erected for William Henry McGladery because he died whilst he was in army service, and it sits at the plot. His daughter Margaret, or Rita, is also recorded on the headstone, but Bridget and Robert are not recorded, not named, and that implies that they are not buried in the plot, and that they again were either buried in reserve ground or there was no body recovered for burial. This one is particularly bad because it's so badly eroded, and it hasn't been well maintained. Might have to nip up sometime and give it see if I can do anything to make it any clearer. In 1939, there were 31 houses in Barber Street in Greencastle. In 1943, there were no houses. And that's an indication of how some areas were so devastated that complete streets were wiped out. Either all the buildings were destroyed, or they were so badly damaged that they were uninhabitable and had to be demolished on safety grounds. 9 people from the Black Dowd families died at number 18 Barber Street on the 5th of May, which was the date of the 3rd air raid. Annie Black was born on 30th of July 1884 at Shipboy Street in Belfast to Isaiah Harrison and Emily O'Neill, and she married Francis Black on 25th June 1906 at Trinity Church of Ireland. Frank died on the 12th of April 1937, aged 52, and Annie was 57 years old when she died during the air raid. Annie, 4 of her children, and the grandchild were buried in this plot in Carnmoney Cemetery on the 8th of May. And that was after a funeral service in White House Presbyterian Church. 2 of her sons, Frank and Robert, were overseas on active service at the time of the air raids. So the Black family, White House Presbyterian Church, buried in Carnmoney Cemetery, which that part of the cemetery is largely Protestant. Annie Black Jr. was born on 29th January 1910 at Ballygoland in White House to Francis Black and Annie Harrison. She married John Dowd on the 3rd of February 1934, and they were living at Dandy Street in Greencastle in 1939. Annie and her daughters were visiting her mother's house in Barber Street when the air raid started. Annie Dowd was 31 when she died, along with 2 of her daughters, Maureen, aged 6, and Anne, aged 2. They were buried in Milltown Roman Catholic Cemetery on the 9th of May 1941 after a funeral mass in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greencastle. There's no headstone at the Dowd plot, but there are Blitz fatalities buried on either side, and there's another Blitz fatality buried here. So again, because a lot of the plots were bought at the same time as a result of the German air raids, you tend to find that there are groupings where in one section you will find quite a lot of headstones for Blitz fatalities. But for a lot of them, where there is no headstone, it's quite often difficult to locate the burial site. But that to me is interesting because we've got a situation there where what we would now term a cross-community family, where the family were mixed religions, with Annie Jr. being buried in the Roman Catholic cemetery, whilst her mother, her sister, and her niece were buried in a Protestant cemetery. Don't want to get too political, so I'm going to go swiftly on. The Mason family. 5 members of the Mason family from Burke Street, which is in the New Lodge area, died in the second air raid. In other words, 15th, 16th April. 4 members of the Mason family were buried in this plot on the 22nd of April after a funeral mass in St. Patrick's Church on Donegal Street. Rose Henry was born on 12th December 1867 at Henry Street in the Dock Ward to Patrick Henry and Catherine Kane. Rose married Richard Mason, who was a carter, on the 24th of December 1900 at St. Patrick's Church on Donegal Street, and they were living at Burke Street in 1911. Rose Mason was 73 years old when she died. Thomas Mason was born on 20th of March 1908 at Balkan Street in the Falls Ward, and he married Mary Malone on 27th August 1934. He worked in the printing trade and was a member of the National Society of Stereotypers and Electrotypers. Thomas Mason was 33 years old when he died at the Mater Hospital on the 28th of April 1941 of injuries received at Burke Street. He was buried on the 30th of April, again after a funeral mass in St. Patrick's Church. So there'd already been one burial in this plot of members of the family, and then the grave was reopened for a subsequent burial. Mary Malone was born on 21st February 1909 at Butler Street in Clifton Ward to James Malone and Nora Sullivan, and was 32 years old when she died. 2 of their children, Thomas and Mary, also died. 2 of the children of Thomas and Mary also died. Richard, aged 6, and Anthony Gerard, aged 3. Also buried in this plot is William Quigley, who is the son of George Quigley and Maggie Mason, who was injured at Burke Street and died at the Union Infirmary on 17th April. He was buried in the plot along with his Mason relatives on the 22nd of April. He was a nephew to Richard Mason and a cousin of Thomas Mason. Another one where there is no memorial at the plot, and this is one which I only discovered, only confirmed, verified last week. 6 members of the McWhinney family from Unity Street died during the air raids. Joseph McWhinney was born on 19th April 1895 at Curtis Street in St. Anne's Ward to Alexander McWhinney and Bridget Crochan. Joseph was a railway labourer when he married Bridget Graham on 4th December 1919 at St. Patrick's Church on Donegal Street. So you can see we've got a cluster of families here in and around the New Lodge Court Ward, with a common theme coming through of St. Patrick's being involved either as the place of marriage or the place from which the funeral took place. He was 45 years old when he died. Joseph McWhinney was 45 when he died. Bridget McWhinney was born on 6th of January 1894 at Macaulay's Court of Petershill to Patrick Graham and Ellen McGuigan. She was 47 when she died. 4 of their children also died. Eileen was 18 and she was serving with the ARP at post 196 on Trinity Street. Trinity Street, in effect, was totally devastated, practically wiped out as a street of houses. Mary was 16 and Joseph was 14 and James was 11. With the exception of Bridget, all the members of the McWhinney family are buried in this plot. This is a newspaper article from the Northern Whig on 19th April 1941, which reported that 5 people from Seaford Street in Ballymacarrat had been taken to the Royal Victoria Hospital after being poisoned by gas escaping from a mains pipe that had been damaged during the air raids, during the bombings. 3 of the people taken to hospital survived, but 2, a father and a son, died on the way to hospital or were pronounced dead on admission to hospital. Patrick Duffy was the son of Charles Duffy and Mary McArdle of Castleblaney in County Monaghan, and he married Margaret Brannigan of Posnet Street on the 1st of August 1912 at St. Malachy's Church in Alfred Street. Patrick Duffy was serving with the Royal Army Service Corps when he died, and thus is entitled to a military headstone, even though he died in a civilian capacity at his own house. Because he was in army service, he qualifies as an official war fatality. His age of death is recorded as 47 in the civil records, 51 on Commonwealth war graves, and he gave his age as 22 when he married. I haven't been able to identify his date of birth, so I can't give a precise age, but there are 3 variations. His son Patrick Joseph Duffy was born on 4th March 1913 at Vernon Street in Cromwell Ward. He was 28 when he died, and as he was not in the army, his name is not recorded on the Commonwealth War Graves headstone, but he is buried in this plot. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings this part of this evening's session to an end. I'm going to undo the stop share, and then I'll be available to answer any questions that the audience may have. And pardon me for spluttering a bit.
Thanks very much, Nigel. That was really, really interesting. We have a couple of questions and a few comments. Just one from myself. I know we were talking kind of earlier in the week, just in relation before your lecture. But like, there's many stories of British Air Force pilots who were crash landed in the Republic being repatriated up north. But are there other examples of cross-border cooperations between the Republic and Northern Ireland?
Yeah, there's a few. Possibly one of the ones which isn't widely known is that fire brigade units from as far away as Dublin, Drogheda, Dundalk and Dublin, came up north, as we say, came up north to help out. And the newspapers reported the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland giving his thanks to the people of Era for their support. There may well have been similar circumstances where fire brigade crews in Donegal came in to help with the situation in Derry. So there was that cooperation where, from a fire service point of view, there was assistance across the border. There's also a few other sort of connections, not necessarily to do with the Blitz, but I know of two of the people who were recorded on the civilian war dead list were from Dublin. One, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, Lionel, can't remember his surname. He was with the Auxiliary Fire Service in Northern Ireland, and he died when he was attending an emergency at Whitehead. He was involved in a road traffic accident and died. He was buried, his body was taken back to Dublin for burial. And there's another guy, I think his name was Strutt, who was an electrician, and he was working at RAF Ballyhalbert on maintenance of the grounds, maintenance of the landing strip. An aircraft that was landing, the pilot lost control, and basically, without wanting to be too gory about it, Frederick Strutt was killed in a collision when the aircraft collided with him. So those are just two examples. One of the other things which I've come across more recently, just this week, is that there were actually German air raids on Dublin and the area around Dublin. And that's an area which has not really been explored, I don't think. I don't know whether there are the same level of records as Commonwealth war graves would have, but certainly there were more air raids. There were 5 air raids in the Dublin area between August 1940 and January 1941. And then there was another fairly major air raid in early June 1941. So those air raids surround the air raids on Northern Ireland, on Belfast and Londonderry and sort of other surrounding areas. And I know that in the June one, I think it was something like 29 people lost their lives in the bombing of Dublin on that particular day. So there's an untold story there, which I think could do with being unravelled. I just don't know who's going to do the unravelling.
I would find someone. Just another question that's kind of popped into my head is like, but is there many, say, markers around Belfast to kind of indicate that, you know, this was where some of the bombings were, or is it kind of like forgotten about?
Well, in true Northern fashion, we have murals. The mural which I showed at the start of the talk is in Tigers Bay, a very loyalist area. Fantastic mural. The detail in it is just phenomenal. You can even see the shells coming out of the aircraft. It is that detailed, and it's definitely worth visiting. If you're in Belfast, don't be afraid to go up to Tigers Bay and have a look at it. It's fantastic. If anyone is and they're unsure of the area, I'm more than happy to accompany anyone there. But Belfast City Council erected a number of plaques to commemorate the people who died during the German air raids. They're mainly in West and Northwest Belfast. There's a few in East Belfast. There's one at each of the 3 temporary mortuaries. So that's St. George's Market, Falls Road Baths and Peters Hill Baths. And then there's others at different localities. There would have been more, but some where the council wanted to erect them, either the residents or the owners of the buildings have refused permission, which I think is a very sad situation. But there are, I can't remember how many there, I think there's about 21 of them around Belfast, and for example, there's one, the North City, the Cityside retail park, there's one there which records the number of fatalities from the York Street area. So there are physical markers, but probably there could be an awful lot more done in that respect.
Yeah. We have Michael's iPhone. He's just saying that his great aunt and her 2 daughters were killed in Glasgow Street. Sarah McCann.
Right.
Stephen McCracken then is saying, as far
Hang on a minute, Stephen. Was that McCann?
McCracken?
No, sorry, the fatality in
Sarah McCann, yeah. Sarah McCann, yeah. Yeah.
Oops.
So
I'm just going into my spreadsheet. So Sarah Baird McCann, who was 50, Glasgow Street. There were 3 members of the McCann family from Glasgow Street died. And they're all buried in Carnmoney Cemetery.
Okay.
This is always a danger. Hot. I'm doing checks on the hoof.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen McCracken.
Stephen's saying it's more in relation to my comments about the pilots who crash landed. So he's just saying that as far as he was aware, any pilots who crash landed in Donegal from the Limavady, Ballykelly, so the Battle of the Atlantic, were taken to barracks outside Dublin, were not allowed to return until after the war.
Right.
The Curragh.
I know there's one situation where it was Polish airmen with the RAF, and I think it was way down near Cork or Wexford, way down right at the very south of Ireland. And one of the bodies was brought back to Belfast for burial in Carnmoney Jewish Cemetery, which is unusual because you've got this there were something like about 13 Polish airmen who are buried in Northern Ireland. But one of them is buried in Carnmoney Jewish Cemetery, which is just something a bit unique. Sorry.
Ed McLean then is so Mrs. Muriel Wilson, chair and CX of the the EOC in the 1980s, as a young civil servant, was involved in identifying the corpses in St. George's Market and putting tags on toes and putting personal effects into shoe boxes. Oh my God.
Well, that's exactly it. Where there's so little left. I know that the head of the VAD services in Belfast at that time, Emma Duffy, who had served as a VAD in the First World War as well, she wrote that what she saw in St. George, she had seen people dying in battlefield hospitals in Egypt and on the Western Front. And she's, in her diary, she said that what she saw in St. George's Market was worse than anything she had seen on a battlefield. And that just gives you an indication. But yes, that's whenever people were identified, there were people from the civil defence, VADs, WVS workers and so forth, and their job was to write out a little label and to attach it to the remains. And that's, you know, the absolute tragedy of that, where that all that can be left of somebody is maybe an arm or a leg or something like that. And I think sometimes we just sort of gloss over and we talk about fatalities, but we forget that with these particular fatalities, so many people were literally blown to pieces that there was nothing left. It was just that people would say, well, my family, there was my mother, my father, and I had 4 other siblings or 4 other brothers and sisters. I am the only one left. That way you can get a figure, but was there anything left of the members of those families? In quite a few cases, there just wasn't anything left to either identify or to bury.
Yeah, shocked really. Maid Banting then is saying, can someone explain a reserve section in a graveyard? Like,
right. Sorry, maybe I didn't explain that properly. The reserved section was basically, it was a section in the 2 graveyards where, rather than there being individual plots, family plots, the council or the Roman Catholic Church had set aside an area within the 2 cemeteries where Blitz fatalities could be buried. So it in a sense, they're mass graves. In a sense, it's common ground graves, but or poor law union graves, poor graves. But instead of using those terms, they've referred to it as reserved ground, because it was ground that was reserved for the fatalities of the German air raids. I would probably prefer to use the term Blitz ground, because that's a bit more obvious. But basically it was ground that City Council said, right, we're reserving this area. Nobody can buy plots in this area because we're reserving it for victims of the air raids. And the Roman Catholic Church did the same in Milltown Cemetery. So I hope that answers that question.
Lorraine Dunn then, her uncle John Thompson, his wife Una, and 2-year-old daughter died in number 4 Ballynewer Street.
Ballynewer Street, yeah. Ballynewer Street was quite badly hit. So what was that surname again?
Thompson, John Thompson. Una's parents, along with Una's parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. Clark and their children. 11 people died in that house, but... Yeah,
yep, there's Una or Eunice. She was 20 years old. And she was a daughter of Jeremiah Clark and Lavinia. I don't have her mother's maiden name yet. She was married to John Thompson. Again, I don't have a burial location for Una. But I think John, yeah. Have I got? Yeah, they died at Ballynewer Street, but their address was Lee Street. So there's John, Joan, and Eunice or Una. And I know that John is buried in Belfast City Cemetery, Glenalina section T1. But the other, Joan and Una, I haven't been able to verify, so it's quite possible they're buried in the reserve ground. Okay, next question, or is that sufficient on that one? Certainly, if anyone wants to contact me or wants to contact me through History Hub Ulster, if you Google History Hub Ulster, there'll be a contact email address where you can either send me any information that you have on your families who died in the Blitz, or if you want to ask questions that maybe you don't want to ask in a sort of a public environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's a few here, but we'll send you on the Liam will send on the few comments that are here. But yeah, it's been a fascinating lecture. It certainly has opened our eyes to the World War II blitzes, I suppose, both in the north and maybe having a look at what happened here in the south. So thanks a million again, Nigel, for facilitating us again, and we will talk again soon, I'm sure.
Well, I'll send you on the stuff which I find out about the Dublin air raids, because one of them, I put it up on Facebook today. It's actually got a map showing the locations sort of outside Dublin which were hit. Sometimes it was just damage to agricultural land or buildings, but sometimes it was more serious. But it wasn't at the same scale, even though there were more bombing raids on Dublin and environs. It wasn't on the same scale as Belfast, and certainly from the point of view of fatality numbers, it was certainly a lot lower. But still, nonetheless, it's a forgotten story. It's a story which I think needs to be brought into the public domain, especially as we're coming up to the centenaries of that. Okay, but you probably missed the 2020 centenary for the ones in August, but certainly when you come into 2021, to deflect away from all that partition nonsense, there's something which the people of Dublin, I think, can focus on there that can bring. And I also know that from one of the newspaper articles that the Jewish synagogue one of the Jewish synagogues in Dublin was also damaged during the air raids on Dublin. But although the fabric of the building was damaged, the crystal chandelier in the middle of the synagogue remained intact, which is the sort of thing which you would expect to be just shattered. So it's just a nice little image that you can have there.
Anyway, thanks again, Nigel. That was great. And thanks for attending. So we'll talk to everyone again soon. Thanks a million. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.